Welcome everybody. Firstly, thank you so much for coming out in this terrible Wellington weather, one of those evenings that is definitely reminds you why we love Wellington and why we persevere. So thank you firstly for that. The second thing is I'm incredibly delighted with the diversity in the room, and that was something that we really wanted to happen, and we did that in a range of different ways. So that's number two, thank you for that. Third, we've tried to make this a really casual and informed and warm environment, and when we were sort of thinking about how we might make that happen, is I remembered that my father had actually given me this 1940 carpet from in celebration of 100 years of New Zealand, believe it or not. So it goes back to Island Bay, and not Island Bay, where it all happened. Sorry, brain dead, it's happened. It's so important, I think, to think about transition and history. And we're going into another type of transition, and a significant transition, and it has a lot of uncertainty. And we were really pleased with the number of young people that were here tonight. Next, I wanted just to talk about a little bit about the aim, because I think one of the things is I didn't want to create an event with climate scientists up in the panel. And there's a reason for that, is I actually think that it's time that we actually put the science to a degree behind us and actually talk more broadly about what this means for our country and ways that we can both deal with getting and achieving the future that we want. So this is just a little brain dump of things that we put up. What should we see as what would the future of New Zealand look like? It's not meant to be something that you necessarily need to agree with, but would be really keen to hear your insights onto what you might add. But it does give you a little bit of a feeling of what we think, and the conversations that we've been having are key drivers for the future of New Zealand. So we're obviously very welcome and feedback on that. So this little diagram here that looks sort of a little bit like hills or nature or whatever is a process that we're going to use, and I'm going to sort of explain that in more detail now. Roger Dennis, who will re-emphasise the importance of this, so I'm going to try and give a brief summary. If you can kind of imagine that we've got this massive transition happening, and everyone's got to somehow find a way of framing the tensions that are going to exist, and it's really difficult. I mean, I had fun when I was trying to think. I sort of knew the panellists I wanted in the room. I didn't really have a real feeling of the order and how I wanted to make and to turn it into a narrative. Because I was thinking, if I was you guys sitting there and I wouldn't know what's starting, what's happening. So this is kind of giving you a narrative for 5 minutes conversation, a snap chat, if you like, with each of these wonderful guests before us. And so the way I would explain it, it's this guy, I'm actually going to leave a bit of this for Roger, but pace layer thinking, basically it's a whole lot of different layers. The top end of the layers, the fashion, commerce, infrastructure, they're relatively easy to change in the system. Governance, culture and nature are much more difficult. And so you've got sort of like a continuum going down the process there. Between the layers is where innovation and interaction happens. And you can see on the right-hand side there, I've got the names of the speakers that are going to speak to each of those. There is no way that any one speaker will not touch on these other aspects. But if you can kind of imagine that what we want to do is try and develop deep thinking and conversations around what fundamentally needs to happen in a very deep and meaningful way. So that's going to be the order, and then I want to talk a little bit more about how I see it. I'm really interested in the future, and I'm always really interested in the lessons from the past. So this is a report that I have found absolutely fascinating. It was written in 1980, and it was written for Jimmy Carter when he was President of the United States. And this graph represents what they knew at that time. I actually personally find myself, when I was reading it, I realised I was actually becoming very angry, because it really meant that in 40 years nothing's happened. So they knew that this was an issue. These scenarios are what they were sort of playing with in terms of expectations, and you can see the no growth in fossil fuels after 1985. The red line that you can see that crosses that graph, we've added on. So in 1980, when they were starting to explore what those scenarios were like, it was interesting. 1980 was the first computerised modelling report, an integrated modelling report that they think happened in the world, but definitely in the States, and was incredibly popular and of interest at that time. It's been largely forgotten about, but the bit is to understand that where we are is largely on track for what they expected if we did nothing, is probably the best way to say it. So it's 40 years. And there was so much I could have quoted, but I chose this quote for the reason, I'm just going to read from the second half. In both cases, it is impossible for an individual nation to protect itself against the consequences of other nations' actions. These problems are truly global in scale, and there is no human institution now established that can adequately address them. So it's actually understanding that, in 1980, that's what they were faced with. And there's, like I said, for anyone that's interested, it's a fascinating report to read. I wanted to direct you to the very bottom. You can see the front cover there, and they've got sort of, believe it or not, that black stuff sliced across the front of the cover, if you can just see the cover of the 1980 report there. And then they've got a description of why that was the cover. And it's really fascinating, because it's talking about its brush strokes, and it's saying that actually they know that there's new brush pieces or parts of the brush that are to be added to. So they sort of saw it as a way of illustrating that they were exploring a landscape where they didn't have all the information, but that they actually saw it was the first time that they would do that. So it's a really lovely narrative if you ever want to have a little look at that. So that's expanded. That gives you a feel that actually not a lot has happened. And then we're just going to quickly look at two graphs in New Zealand. I just felt it was important to get these across. New Zealand's gross emissions have increased 23%, not 1980 as I mentioned, but from 1990. And also this one here, which is looking at our per capita, which is showing that New Zealand's gross emissions ranked 24th, but our emissions per person were the 7th highest. So that sort of makes me feel, puts a lot of responsibility on us to actually care and do stuff more than a lot of other countries on the planet. So, and I take on board that responsibility, which is why I really wanted to hold this. Right up the top is our profile. Most of you will have seen that graph, but if you haven't, you'll find it really easily. So just the New Zealand profile, which is largely, obviously, all the agriculture on the right-hand side. So this is a diagram I use a lot. It's called the cone of plausibility. And basically this was actually looking, you'll be aware of the global warming of 1.5% summary. This is part of the headline. So basically this narrative was asking the IPCC to look at what the difference between what 1.5 would look like in regard to 2 degrees Celsius increase. So when we talk about the cone, we talk about probable futures, which is what this red one is doing. So in other words, we started in 1980, 40 years in, we're still in the same direction. And then we're going forward to 2030, 2050. If you like, we try and get to 1.5, and then we go to, potentially they talk about in here, getting to 2 degrees at 2070. But what we're looking at is how ruthless we want to be and the outcomes of the value add of if we act early. So there's a massive tension here in terms of do we act early and to have a lot of pain, but the outcome for future generations, the ecosystems is really good, or do we not act early and obviously the opposite happens? So that diagram is just useful for that sort of narrative. We've put up a view that there needs to be a climate strategy. The climate response, the amendment to the Climate Response Act is actually putting some work in towards developing a strategy. It does mention adaptation, but I would argue that actually we need something even bigger and more integrated, and that these tensions. So having these kind of conversations around who, what, when, where, why and how, that's what we're sort of trying to put on the table here as a start of that. This is, you can have a look at it in your own time, but it's just, there's a lot of conversations about the transition and a strategy for that, but there's also this whole concept around the physical risks and the assets, local government, so forth. So it's quite a large narrative there. And this is a piece of work that we just looked at, government department strategies that currently exist. A lot of them lightly mention climate change, but there's very little that actually has any significance other than the identification of the risk in government at the moment. So the real opportunity is to actually make that happen, and I think the more organisations that try and put their view of what a climate strategy looks like, the better for New Zealand, because that means when the Climate Commission, which I'm sure will happen, will actually have as big a dialogue and more integrated approach already in the general public, and those ideas should be able to be brought forward. So basically that we can kickstart the Climate Change Commission as quickly as we possibly can. So that's enough from me, apart from this lovely little thing. It's most will have come across the marshmallow test, but this is probably, if I had to, understanding self-control and how to master it. So I thought that was a very good place to pass over to Connell. Okay, and who's going to share with us his observations. So thank you, Connell.